Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Emanuel Rosen. He's the author of a brand new book called If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died. What an incredible story, Emanuel's journey to retrace the footsteps of his grandfather, Dr. Hugo Mendel, who was a lawyer in Germany, a successful lawyer, who shortly after Hitler took power in 1933, received a letter saying that he could no longer practice law since he was not Aryan, in other words, since he was Jewish. His grandparents then moved to Israel, what was then Palestine, to Tel Aviv. And then 23 years later, they took a trip back to Germany to see what they would see upon returning to Germany now, a few years after the end of World War II, at the end of the Holocaust. It's a story about the impact of the Holocaust, even beyond the horrific magnitude of death and destruction that so many of us are familiar with. This is a story about displacement, a loss of identity, a survivor's guilt, and the steps that Emanuel's mother took to, as he puts it, to close the circle on the story of her parents, Emanuel's grandparents. An incredible journey, a fascinating story. I know you will be equally riveted by the story and will be as interested in reading the book as I was. Again, Emanuel Rosen, author of the book, If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died. What a great story, and I know you will enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. So I want to welcome my guest today, Emanuel Rosen. He is the author of a new book called If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died. It's a fascinating journey that Emanuel went on to discover the real story about his grandfather, a survivor of the Holocaust in Germany. So first of all, Emanuel, welcome, and thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This is, as I mentioned to you before we got started, this is a subject, very broadly speaking, near and dear to me, as I also wrote a post-war, post-Holocaust book before I went to law school, actually, in my prior life as a journalist and writer. So I was really drawn to the story you tell of your grandmother and grandfather, your grandfather who was a lawyer in Germany, actually. Perhaps you could start by giving us a little bit of your own background and then how you came to set out on this quest to discover the truth behind your grandfather's death after the end of World War II.
Sure, yeah. I was born in Israel in 1953. I had a very happy childhood, and I did not see myself as being connected to the Holocaust in any way. The Holocaust was something we learned about at school, but I was happy. I was raised by a single mother. My father died when I was very young, and I knew that I had once a grandfather. We called him Opa. He was originally from Germany. But I didn't know anything, almost anything about his past. I knew that he was a lawyer in Germany. And I was raised, as I said, by my mom, and my grandmother helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the background about my grandfather, he was a respected lawyer in Germany up to 1933. His name was Dr. Hugo Mendel. And in 1933, once Hitler took power, he was no longer allowed to appear in court, uh, essentially because he wasn't Jewish. The way it's phrased on the letter, in the letter it says, because you don't belong to the Aryan race, a letter he got in May of 1933. Now, before that, there was a little bit of back and forth. He protested it, but after a while, he realized that he has no future in Germany. He and my grandmother decided to immigrate to Tel Aviv, which was Palestine at the time, and they each of them opened a business there. The businesses failed. In 1956, that is 23 years after they had left Germany, they decided to go back on a 2 month trip to Germany. And 5 months after their return to Tel Aviv, my grandfather committed suicide. He jumped to his death.
Wow.
Now, again, I did not know anything about that. And after my mother passed away, I found a box with letters. And it took me a while to understand that these were letters that they had sent my mother from that 1956 trip. And I started to realize, but then I knew that my grandfather committed suicide because later in life, my mother told me that. Mm-hmm. I realized that these letters may hold the answer to why he did it, because I did not understand why he did it. So I had the letters translated, and the letters did not have too many answers. They actually left me with more questions. And I decided to go to Germany. I went to Germany, followed their footsteps in that trip.
And the letters were written in what language to your mother originally?
The letters were written in German, and they were also written in a language I do not read. I can understand some German because my grandmother never spoke any Hebrew, so she spoke to me in German, but not enough so that I know, and I could definitely not recognize decipher their handwriting. So I had someone help me with that. Mm-hmm. And in Germany, I tried to recreate their trip. So I took the same trains, I slept in the same hotels, I sat in the same cafes. My grandfather was very precise, very good about explaining exactly where they were. He didn't express much more in the letters, but he was really clear about where they went. And then in the city of Hamm, Westphalia, this is where my grandfather practiced law. I was handed a thick folder that opened my eyes to a different part of the story. It turned out that a few years after the suicide, my mother initiated a legal battle against the German authorities to prove that those who expelled him from his profession and from his cultural environment were in fact responsible for his death. Mm-hmm. So my book is my trip following my grandparents' trip and about that lawsuit later in the 60s.
Incredible. So, okay, so take us through your trip a little bit first, and then we'll get into the legal claims that your mother filed. Her father. Yeah.
My trip was strange, sometimes even surreal. I'll never forget the first time I landed in Düsseldorf, which was where they arrived in Germany. And I put my stuff in the hotel and started walking. I knew exactly where they walked. I stayed in the same hotel, and I knew they were describing different streets. And all around me, I was hearing German, of course, but I was also hearing German in my head because I don't know exactly why, but I was left with all these words that I don't understand their meanings because, again, as I said, my grandmother always spoke German to me. But that was a strange experience. And just seeing the train station, I remember that I stared at before, in that in a postcard that they sent from the trip. It was very surreal.
So wait, so let me ask Emanuel. So what year was it that you went on this trip to Germany?
I went on in 2003.
In
So
2000.
that was a few years ago.
Yeah.
And then I kept going. I went to one thing I couldn't understand, because their letters from Düsseldorf are very bitter, they were clearly extremely unhappy. And I didn't understand why they don't just either go back to Israel or move on to their next stop, which was Wiesbaden, where they said, we want to go to Wiesbaden. I didn't understand why. And then some months later, when I came home in California, I discovered that they issued 2 German passports. So that was another thing. Why did they issue a German passport? So along the way, there were these little mysteries, new mysteries that I uncovered. And then I went to Wiesbaden. Wiesbaden indeed was a nicer place for them. That's where in their letters you start to sense some relief, some happiness even. But overall, the trip was, I cannot say that they had fun. They really did not have fun, although they say in one of their letters that they came to Germany to rest from 23 years of hardship, because they didn't have easy time in Israel. My grandfather, as I said, opened a factory, and the factory failed after a few years. My grandmother opened a cafe that failed. So they had a hard time in Israel. From being a respected lawyer in a city in Germany, he became a salesman after a while, who had to walk from one store to another in Tel Aviv, in the heat of Tel Aviv, sell his stuff. There was definitely a fall in their status.
And had you ever been to Germany before this trip?
I was once in the mid-90s at the trade show, so that was a different experience. And back then I did go and made a quick visit to Hamm, Westphalia. That's where my mother was born, and that's where he practiced law, which was also a little surreal in its own way. But this was the first time that I went for a longer period of time.
Mm. And when your grandparents went back to Germany in 1956, what was your understanding of what they were going to try to find? Had they lost family? Were they just trying to, see what had become of their home there? What was their reason for going back when they took the trip in 1956?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a very clear answer, because, as I said, in their letter, they said that they came to rest. I suspect that there are several options to explain it. One was that they missed their homeland. Especially my grandfather felt very connected to Germany, and this was, in his soul, he was a German lawyer, and he was very proud of this. This was his identity. I think that for my grandmother, part of it might have been that she simply wanted to see him at the last place where she saw him happy, which was in Hamm, Westphalia. So that's a possibility. There is also a possibility that he was thinking of going back and practicing law there, because he knew quite a few Jewish German lawyers who went back, and he in fact met them on this trip, including Ernst Katzenstein, who was at the time the head of the claims conference. Was the organization that negotiated with Germany the restitution and reparations. So Ernst Katzenstein was someone he knew. He met, they were invited to their home in Frankfurt. Now, Ernst Katzenstein was not permanently in Germany, but my grandfather knew people who were, and essentially went back to Germany and practiced law again. So that's another possibility, that this might have been something on his mind.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so they're also very curious about the experience of your own feelings going back. I mean, this was about going to find your grandparents' story, really, but also as the grandson of Holocaust survivors and the son of a Holocaust survivor. That must have been a pretty strange mix of feelings for you yourself going back to Germany.
Yes, yes, I was, as I said, very confused at first. I felt um, I definitely did not belong there. I obviously, when I walked around in 2003, it's not like you. I looked at people and said, "What did you do during the war?" Which was very different from their experience, because I'm sure as they were in Germany in 1956, this was constantly on their mind because there were people with Nazi past all around,
Right.
obviously, and
Well, and by that point, by 1956, a lot of people who had been removed from their positions as teachers and judges and police officers and government clerks and so on had been restored to those positions. There was, there was sort of denazification immediately after the war, and then there was a period of renazification in a certain sense in Germany, right around that time.
absolutely, and they, in fact, one side story that I tell in the book, which still shocks me, there was the head of the psychiatrist clinic in Düsseldorf. I found out later, a man who during Nazi time sent psychiatric patients to their death as part of their quote unquote cleaning or improving the Aryan race. That man was the head of the psychiatric clinic in like 10 minutes from their hotel. And he reappears later in my story because he also served as a witness, expert witness in the trial later, which I still cannot get over. So the situation that they faced, I'm not surprised, was very different than the situation I faced. I felt it felt strange. I have to say that over time, and writing this book actually helped me feel differently about German. I was working with a team of translators. There is also a German version of my book that really became friends, and I have a good friend, a person who I mentioned in the book by the name of Mechthild Brandt, who grew up in Hamm, in that town, in that city. And she's a person who wrote a book about the local Jews. But when she started doing the research on this book, people told her that there was no Jewish issue in Hamm because there were never Jews here. And she uncovered everything that went on, including the story of my grandfather and other lawyers. Hamm was a place, that still is, of the Oberlandesgericht, which is the highest regional court. So it attracted quite a few lawyers, including Jewish lawyers. But overall, I felt that on that 2003 trip, I still felt pretty strange about Germany.
Right. Okay, so was it in this town where your grandfather had practiced law that you were handed this folder of papers? And tell us that story, because that sounds like a pivotal moment in this entire story for you.
Yes, and this was actually Mechthild Brandt who gave me that folder. And the funny thing, actually, it's not funny, but it just shows how much I cared about this whole story before I grew up or became aware of how significant it is. She gave me a folder that my mother sent her. This was the whole lawsuit was in that folder that my mother essentially initiated. Officially, it's a lawsuit that my grandmother filed, but my mother was really the person behind it. And my mom asked me at some point if I want that. I couldn't read German, so I just told her no, and she said, okay, I'll send it to Meshtil. Meshtil was the person who wrote that book about the local Jews. She knew that she would do something with it, and once I told Meshtil that I'm writing a book about it, then she gave me this folder.
I see.
And this folder describes 7 years, over more than 7 years of a lawsuit against the state of Northern Rhine-Westphalia, claiming that essentially those who expelled my grandfather from his law profession, from his identity, were responsible for his death. So when I went back to California, of course, I had someone, again, the same person, translated or helped me translate all the documents. It's a very long and complicated lawsuit.
And what this is when people think about the Holocaust and restitution and reparations, they think about the people who were killed in the death camps or in one of the concentration camps. That is, people who stayed, and so this is a little different. This is a little different way of thinking about the victims of the Holocaust, in that your grandfather had a life. He and your grandmother had a whole life there. He had a career there. He had a status, reputation, profession, livelihood, and he lost all of that.
Yes,
and so that seems like that's a fascinating basis for a lawsuit. And how did that go? How did your grandmother and your mother's case go after they filed this claim?
Yeah. First of all, I agree that it shows something about the Holocaust which is beyond the people who perished in the Holocaust, which is just horrifying. But here you see people who were, quote unquote, the lucky ones, but they suffered, and they're not the only ones. There were millions of people like that who suffered from uprooting, from feelings of guilt, because they did have members of the family who stayed in Germany or even went back. I talk about in the book about my great-grandmother, Netchen Stern, who came to see them in Tel Aviv and then went back to Germany and was deported to Riga, where she died, Riga, Latvia. So that caused my grandmother and everyone involved great feelings of guilt, and a lot of survival of guilt is well known. So,
so let me make sure I understand. So in other words, your great grandmother stayed after your grandparents left Germany in 1933, actually visited them in Tel Aviv, I guess sometime in the 1930s, and then went back to Germany, and then was essentially sent to her death when she got back to Europe.
Yes, exactly. She came to Tel Aviv in 1935 and went back to Germany in 1936. And I've heard about similar cases. People did not know what's going to happen, but that left them with great feelings of guilt. I suspect that my mother felt guilty about it too, and they obviously later my mom and my grandma felt guilty about the suicide, which people pick. Whenever there is suicide, sometimes families feel guilty about it. So that just to show that there were all these other side effects, and some of this had to do simply with the uprooting, and I think it's relevant today when we talk about deportation. People sometimes say, "Oh yeah, no problem." We used to have a president who was talking about deporting 11 million people from this country. Among these 11 million people, there may be many people who would suffer greatly because of this of deportation.
Right.
But going back to the lawsuit, so it started with a claim, not a lawsuit. The claim was rejected after a year or so, and then my mother and her boss. My mother worked at a law firm as a secretary. Her boss was a lawyer who dealt with restitution, and she convinced my grandmother to go ahead and file the lawsuit, and then the the lawyer on the German side, there was a lawyer who represented them in the day-to-day issues at the court, informed them that the court assigned an expert witness, and the expert witness, he gave the name, and then they did not know who that person was, but that indeed was that Nazi psychiatrist who during Nazi times was part of the notorious T4 program that sent mentally ill people to their deaths to improve, quote unquote, the Aryan race.
Wow.
I wish I could go back in time and tell my mom that. They had no idea. They, in their letters, they just want the expert witness to issue his opinion faster. That's the only thing they care about.
Now, in this country, when you have a lawsuit and there's an expert witness, usually there's an expert on both sides. There's an expert that the claimant hires, and then very often there's an opposing expert. So what was it here? Was this Dusseldorf former Nazi psychiatrist an expert hired by your family to show that your grandfather's suicide was related to his displacement and the loss of his profession and essentially these anti-Semitic acts that went into effect right after Hitler came to power? Or was he somebody hired by the court, or what was his
He was hired by the court, and
Okay.
In this case there was no expert witness on the other side. He was hired by the court. It took him a long time to come back with his opinion. I guess that's the way it was done there.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came back with his opinion, not surprisingly, because he was also, his whole philosophy was that it's all about the person. The external stressors do not play a role or play a minimal role in psychological effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so not surprisingly, his opinion was that there is no link between the persecution in 1933 and the suicide in 1957. It's due to physiological reasons, end of story. Surprisingly, the court did not accept his opinion, which my mother's boss, in one of his letters, he says, I'm very surprised, because usually it does happen that courts tend to accept expert opinions. That's what he says about these cases. I guess they were different than the way it goes in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible, and now that I think about it, it's possible that they knew something about him, because I came across another case of a widow where his lawyer, her lawyer refused to accept him as an expert witness because of his past.
Refused to accept the same psychiatrist, the same Dusseldorf.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he refused to accept him because his past, the past of that man was pretty known, because he had to go to trial and was acquitted, and that ties to some things that were going on in the justice system in Germany, etc. I suspect. This is not something that I actually checked, but what we talked about earlier about the Nazis being again part of the system in Germany after a short period of time. But surprisingly, the court ruled that indeed, there is a link between the events of 1933 and the suicide, and then the other side, the state, it was a state, appealed, and then another expert witness was assigned to the case.
Mm-hmm.
So that expert witness had once I read about that expert witness, who was a professor from Heidelberg and had a totally different outlook on psychiatry, he completely understood that external stressors play a role in how people react. And he, in fact, had written a book or co-authored a book about survivors. So he ruled in favor of my grandmother.
Okay. And so what was the result then? I mean, did they pay compensation, or was this just an acknowledgement of responsibility? I mean, the German legal system is very different than what we know of in this country. So how did the case turn out in the end for your family?
And I know very little about the German legal system or the American legal system. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not. I wrote about my family and what I found from that file. But the result was a pension that my grandmother started getting a monthly sum and that was very important to my mom, that she would have a source of income in her later years. By that time, she was already 70 years old, and she got some of the money retroactively, so she got a nice amount. I think the most important thing to my mother was it was for her a closing of a circle,
right?
Because my mom. And that's another side effect of this uprooting, the shattered dreams. My mom was born in 1922, which was the first year that women were allowed to appear in court. And her father actually had plans for her. He noticed my mom was brilliant. And at age 4, she knew how to read. At age 10, she already cited whole paragraphs from the German law book. So he had his eyes on her and she told me, that's something she told me, that he told her, you'll be my partner, etc. Of course, at age 11, this was gone because suddenly she had to go to to Tel Aviv. And she kept having this dream, by the way. She also she studied law at the London Extension in Tel Aviv for a while. But in any case, I think that this lawsuit was a closing of a circle for her. She was never a lawyer, but she worked for at least 30 years as a secretary at a law office and did some independent work as well. And this lawsuit that showed that the Nazis were responsible for her father's death, I think was very important to her.
There's so many layers to this story, and I'm just hearing you talk about how your grandfather had his eye on his daughter, your mother, in the 1920s, that she could be a lawyer, shows how in so many ways Germany at that time was so enlightened, relative to the rest of the world. The idea that, first of all, a father would identify a daughter for that, that would have been extremely rare in this country. And that, to think that a woman would be a successful practicing lawyer, again, in this country, it took people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others many, many years later to break through some of those glass ceilings, in practicing law and teaching law and becoming judges in this country. So, it's just a tiny window into what life was like, and not just for Germans, but for Jews in Germany, before the 1930s set in. So that's another really fascinating part of the story as well, I think.
Yeah, there were by 1933 there were 20 Jewish lawyers, women lawyers in Germany. All of them, of course, immediately were stripped away from their rights to appear in court and practice law. But there are about 20 women who were Jewish lawyers. It's definitely true that Germany at the time in the 20s was very liberal, and that's possibly part of the reason there was such a strong reaction from people who didn't like that and started to react.
So, Manuel, I mean, and I've often thought of this when I worked on my book and over the years since, that of course the Holocaust is a uniquely Jewish story. I mean, 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust, and as you point out, so many more, millions more, displaced, upended, uprooted, forced to relocate, many who lost everything. But it wasn't only Jews, of course, in the Holocaust, and there are other experiences that we can look to, and you've already pointed out the issue of millions of immigrants to the United States who still don't have legal status in this country, in the United States, as at least a way of understanding the impact on those people and their families. What I'm curious, this is obviously about your family. It's a very personal journey, but what are some of the other things that you feel you've learned from this experience that not only shed light on your own family's history, but cast a broader light on
Yeah.
the human experience and what we can understand about your family's experience from that.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little anecdote that at first may look that it's not connected, but it is to your question. So my mother had a brother who immigrated with them. His name was Rafi, and he later became a Mossad agent who was in fact the head of one of the Mossad units to hunt down Nazi criminals. And after he died, I learned that he was in charge of the contact with Fritz Bauer, who was the Jewish German district attorney of the state of Hessen, who gave Israel the whereabouts about the Eichmann trial. And so I was there in Ham sitting with a team of translators, and we were working on this paragraph that tells this story. I just mentioned it briefly, but in the morning we were working on this. And we were working in the morning, then we went for lunch, and one of the translators came back after lunch with a stamp in memory that was issued just 2 days earlier in memory of Fritz Bauer. And he gave it to me. He stood in line at the post office, which I thought was very nice of him, and he gave it to me. And there is a quote from Fritz Bauer on this stamp. And I asked him, well, what does it mean? Because I don't understand German. And the meaning of that quote is, nothing is a thing of the past. Everything is present and can become the future again.
Wow.
Nothing is a thing of the past. Everything is present and can become the future again. And I think this long anecdote is to say that things can very easily change and go back to what they were or close to what they were. And we see the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany now and in other places of the world. And as you said, it's not only a Jewish story. There are so many other parallel stories. And there is a story of the uprooted people. There are millions of people all around the world who suddenly find themselves in a place that is totally strange to them. Think about a Syrian refugee in Germany or in Sweden who maybe used to be an accountant, a respected accountant or a lawyer, and now they work, maybe they got a little food stand or God knows what. And you see these stories again and again. Or think about a woman who was brought as a kid with no papers to this country, and suddenly someone decides that she needs to be sent back to the country of her parents. Maybe she speaks the language, maybe not, but she most likely is not familiar with the culture there. So
Right.
uprooting and deportation can have sometimes deadly consequences, as it was a case in my grandfather. Some people thrive in the new environment. It's not that everyone is badly affected, but overall, it's a very different experience. And I think what I tried to do in this book is just show one case, one family. Some of them adjusted, some didn't, and one even jumped to his death because of that.
Unbelievable story. Wow. Emanuel, the book you've written, which has just come out, is called "If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died." Where does the title come from in the story?
Oh, the title is actually something my mom used to say every afternoon before her nap time. That was kind of her daily joke. German Jews have this thing called Schlafstunde. They take a siesta. I'm sure not all of them, but she did, and I do still. And so she would say, if anyone calls, tell them I died. Of course, once you know the story, it takes a little bit of a different meaning.
Right. Oh my gosh. Great, incredible story. I'm really excited to read the book and plan to over the next week. We will put a link to the book so people can get a hold of it easily in the description for this episode. Again, the title of the book is If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died. This is Emanuel Rosen's journey to uncover and retrace the footsteps of his own grandfather, Dr. Hugo Mendel, and his grandmother in Germany. An incredible story with so many profound ways of applying some of what you discovered to so many other people's experience. So thank you very much for sharing your story with us, Emanuel, and your book as well. What a pleasure to meet you and speak with you and have you be on our podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron.